off the leash. Okay, right. Audrey Hepburn running wild in Rome as a princess, incognito, and finding a love interest in Gregory Peck, etc., etc. There's a little bit of that with reference to Goethe's arrival in Italy from Weimar, where he was very successful, but his life was he was feeling very stifled in many ways. And he speaks of his visit to Rome, visit to Italy, as an enormous liberation in all kinds of ways. And the painting that is attributed to this by Tischbein, Goethe in the Roman countryside, he is aged 38, so he's working through a middle-age crisis. He's in a platonic relationship in Weimar, which is not very satisfying. And one of the things he doesn't talk about in the Italienische Reise is the more kind of affectionate or erotic adventures he had in Rome. But certainly some people would take a look at this painting and see a certain amount of erotic satisfaction as well as aesthetic. But the general point of the story that we're explaining is that the visit to Rome is an aesthetic, but also in many ways a spiritual liberation for him. And it's the way in which those two threads interweave that is significant for us. This is midway through Goethe's life. He's written the Sturm und Drang stuff. He's done the Werther sorrows, and he's kind of exhausted that. And the great work of Faust is yet to come. And this is kind of midway in his life. And so therefore that text is seen as a kind of important springboard. Now the quotation which comes towards the end of the novel, and towards the end of the text rather, which I want to flag up here just in case I don't have time to talk about it very much, I think is absolutely gorgeous. And this in a way just pinpoints one of the things that I just find fascinating about this text. If every human individual is to be considered only as a supplement to all the others, if he's never so useful or so lovable as when he is content to play this part, this must be particularly true for travelers and writers of travel books. Personality, purpose, the times, the chances of fortune and misfortune are different in every case. If I know a traveler's predecessors, I find profit in reading him too, and shall welcome his successor with pleasure, even if in the meantime I've been so fortunate as to visit the same country myself. So we'll return to that quotation a bit later on. But just a little text, also a little aside. One of his first stops off, and he finds himself en route to Italy. He stops off the Jesuit College in Regensburg, and I loved this quotation where he attends a theatrical production, and he picks up something very special, very distinctive about what's going on at the Jesuit College. The acting was no worse than that of any other group of inexperienced amateurs. Their costumes were beautiful indeed, almost too magnificent. Their performance reminding once again of the worldly wisdom of the Jesuits. They rejected nothing which might produce an effect, and they knew how to use it with love and care. Their wisdom was no coldly impersonal calculation. They did everything with a gusto, a sympathy, and a personal pleasure in the doing, such as the usage of life gives. And the German phrase, das Gebrauch des Lebens, that uses the familiarity with life. So the Jesuits, every bit as calculating and manipulative as you think they are, and yet there is a joy in the doing, there's a joy in the performance, which Goethe seems almost to envy a little bit. And just a kind of remark, this is before he's even got to Italy. And he gets to Italy, and talking particularly about Rome, the heading of the text, Et in Arcadio ego, we'll have to return to that also. But he gushes with enthusiasm for this long-awaited, long-postponed visit to the Eternal City. Wherever I walk, I come upon familiar objects in an unfamiliar world. Everything is just as I imagined it, yet everything is new. I've not had a single idea which is entirely new or surprising. But my old ideas have become so much more firm, vital, and coherent that they could be called new. Rome is a school for the whole world. I've been purged and tested here. Here, the most ordinary person becomes somebody. that their mind is enormously enlarged. And who looks seriously about them and has eyes to see is bound to become a stronger character, acquiring a sense of strength unknown to them. Their soul receives the seal of a soundness, a seriousness without pedantry, and a joyous composure. I've been changed to the very marrow of my bones. There's nothing to compare, of course, to seeing works of art in the physical location. And much as it's nice to see a picture of the Belvedere Apollo, it is the sheer joy of seeing works of art like this for the first time that is so important for Goethe. What is interesting is the kind of religious themes that run through this as well. And one of the things that is surprising about the text is it's at points surprisingly sympathetic towards Roman Catholicism. Although Goethe decidedly non-Christian and as he described himself in various places, a kind of instinctive Protestant, and yet you feel him looking at Catholicism, wanting it to work, wanting it to kind of be effective. And the disappointment he describes when he goes to Mass at St. Peter's. And the significant thing is that it's a Mass of all souls. And he says, well, the Catholics, they're into their old souls, they're into saints. This should be worth going to. And the disappointment that he experiences of watching this Holy Father pottering around the altar, muttering just like any ordinary priest. The original sin of the Protestants stirred in me, and I felt no pleasure whatsoever in the sacrifice of the Mass. And anybody who's ever been to a disappointing liturgy knows what that feels like. And the words "Venio interim crucifigi" come to mind. And what he does is he nudges his companion, and they go out and they look at pictures in the gallery instead, including this very interesting one, Guercino's burial of St. Petronilla, Petronilla being the daughter of St. Peter, and her martyrdom is described here, her burial and her ascension and reception into heaven. And as Goethe says, whatever you make the theology of this painting, the painting itself is absolutely priceless. Guercino, incidentally, interesting as one of the first artists to depict the theme of et in Carteria ego. Even in death, even in Arcadia, I am found. Death is the speaker here. And even in the bucolic scenery, death is to be found. Death is to be present. And there's a sense that even Goethe can recognize that in this wonderful experience he's having, the sense of decay is never far away. There's lots more that I could talk about, but that instinctive sympathy for Catholicism and its communitarian aspects is one of the things that I don't think does show through in his really quite extraordinary appraisal of the saints. And there's a lovely passage of approval of Philip Neri, of all people, as a very kind and saintly man who Goethe clearly has a lot of time for. And there are lots of examples of where he's repulsed by Catholic ritualism. And I think it's a very lovely symbol of where he speaks of his disgust at watching candles, devotional candles being placed before artistic masterpieces. And of course, the candles are destroying the work of art. And this, for him, you can see, is a kind of symbol. And later in Faust, Faust speaks to Gretchen of religion being like a smoke that just kind of obscures and gets in the way. And that symbol there, at times he is repulsed by self-satisfaction and ritualism, and yet he is drawn to the communal aspects. And there's something here, I would argue in greater length, of his yearning to connect, his yearning to be part of the kind of community of saints, you might say, that Catholicism seems to offer. And romanticism, in that sense, is a dead end. The lonely isolation of someone like Werther is a dead end, literally. and he's looking for something else and not finding it. And I think the little clue of how a travel writer relates to those who read his or her book, I think, is a lovely kind of moving appraisal of that. It's almost a throwaway statement of what it is for a human being to be useful or lovable as a kind of supplement to everybody else. It's extraordinary. It suggests a Levinasian responsibility for all the others. And its evocation of the kenotic mind of Christ and of the gospel call to lay down one's life for a friend. This could not be further away from the hypnotic and predatory solitude of the restlessly self-affirming, self-deceiving romantic subject. And I could go on, but I'm going to finish there and bring Michael in, and we might have questions or discussions after that, but I just wanted to kind of flag up, as I say, my enthusiasm for a particular text, which I think has got a lot of depth of it for its kind of intertwining of religious and aesthetic themes. The journey is a pilgrimage of artistic, but also religious and spiritual proportions. Yeah, I'll shut up there. Michael, over to yourself.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate it. I really enjoyed your remarks, and I look forward to circling back. I do have to, I need to share my screen as well. I'll give it a shot. Let's see. I need to be a co-host, I believe.
Yeah.
And I'm not presently.
Oh my gosh.
Not a tragedy, but I did ask earlier, but maybe I'm not gonna hold up our time. It's just if I can do it on the run. If I become a co-host, I will open my slides. So, but I don't want to waste our time here, so I will begin. Like so. So let's see here. My title is Michel Houellebecq, Submission and Literature of Spiritual Exhaustion. So I'll read a paper. Okay, so the call of literature has always been, at least in potential, an invitation to encounter the radiance of theology and philosophy through the multivalence of its aesthetic forms. As Holderlin observes beautifully in the fourth strophe of his last elegy, Bread and Wine, written in 1801, the word is abroad in the world as a gift sign of community and a relationship with the maker. The word, quotes, called and flew from tongue to tongue 1,000 times, and nobody had to endure life alone. Shared, such fortune is a joy. Exchange with strangers, it becomes jubilant. Sleeping, the power of the word grows. Father, joyful, the ancient sign resounds as far it reaches, inherited from the elders, striking, creating. Thus the gods enter. Thus the season of the gods falls from the shadows down to men, shaking the depths. I have a slide here. You would see Joseph Pieper's 1963 book, In Tune with the World. And there's some quotes. So, but Pieper integrates the Holderlin elegy so beautifully in his text, specifically in its liturgical quality, and it figures into my remarks today. Did this elegy, with its celebration of the power of the word, inspire the conference? I feel like I should know this, but I don't. Anyway, it's a nice coincidence. With this prologue in mind, this presentation will explore the various ways that spirituality, theology, and religion function in Michel Houellebecq's dystopian satire, Submission, Soumission, published in 2015. From the escalating fatigue and acedia of its protagonist, Francois' personal life, to his lazy, self-preserving conversion to Islam that concludes the novel, we are called to see in Francis a symbol of something bigger, and something so quietly tragic. How Western capitalism is itself a religion. and how its demands, described in the shorthand and catch-all term of neoliberalism, are both unique and all-encompassing. Francois' tragicomic capitulation to this reality and to the fraudulent versions of religion that sustain this reality make available a sustained reading of the novel as a kind of fable. In this case, give me 1 second here. I'm going to reorient my eyes on an electronic copy and continue on more comfortably. So let's see here. Great. Let's see. Yeah. So in this case, Francois is let's see. Yeah. So with this reading, there's a sustained possibility for reading the novel as a fable. So in this case, Francois is so blatantly and aptly named. In the reading, he becomes not only a symbol of France and its capitulation to neoliberalism, but of all Western cultures that operate like lemmings off a cliff from the demanding catechisms and rituals of insatiable consumerism and corpse cold technocracy. My remarks will also integrate peeper and philosopher Byung-Chul Han, whose work on festivity, ritual, and exhaustion were part of the genesis of this paper when I began thinking about it a couple of years ago, and whose insights are more extensive and connected in the longer version of this paper. Submission takes place in a France in the very near future of 2022. It is an election year, and there is a resurging nationalism on the one hand, and battles over cultural agency and political liberty on the other. The Republican parties have split, and the two top vote getters are Marine Le Pen on the extreme right and Mohammed Ben Abbas, a Ulbeck-invented character who is the leader of the French Muslim Brotherhood. In the runoff, the French left backs Ben Abbas, and in a second general election, the first having been negated after widespread voter fraud, Ben Abbas handily beats Le Pen with support from both socialists and the right. The Ben Abbas government soon imposes a kind of relaxed Sharia law throughout France. Crime drops, and there emerges a kind of functional peace. Francois is assured a job and 3 wives, and in the new regime. And as critic Adam Gopnik observes, this is the book's central joke and point, quote, that the French elite are cravenly eager to collaborate with the new regime, delighted not only to convert, but to submit to a bracing and self-assured authoritarianism. Gopnik punctuates his observation by offering that, like the over-sophisticated Hellenists of Cavafy's poem, the French depicted in Ulbeck's novel have been, quote, secretly waiting for the barbarians all of their lives. Astute critics have rightly observed that Ulbeck's target in the novel is not Islam. Instead, it's quote, the myopic chattering classes, intellectuals, politicians, and journalists who bear the lash of Ulbeck's critique. Ulbeck creates a character, a Francois, a misanthropic misogynist, Huysmans scholar, whose only interest in teaching is in finding students for his serial affairs, like Huysmans, but in a manner that is derivative and unoriginal, unlike Huysmans. Like Huysmans, Francois feels, quote, plunged into decadence by the pressures of modern life. And like Huysmans, his response to these pressures, is to gorge his way into decadence and crisis. But unlike Huysmans, such gorging can be accomplished in 2022 in a morally indifferent, sanitary, economically rewarding, socially normative, and spiritually non-transcendent way. The grain Francois works against, to work from Huysmans, is one that has been adopted and embedded by a late modern culture, so much so as to be a chief attribute. There is nothing disruptive or transgressive about it, nothing au revoir. His misogyny, too, is banal and co-opted, as Francois divides women into 2 categories, good little cooks or good little playmates. And he makes deft use of online escorts to further pad his tedious hungers and his habits of ritual commodification. Even if these experiences are repetitive, mechanical, and they provide zero gratification. Here's a quote. It was the same as before. Though I never lost my erection, I never experienced any pleasure either. The truth was, I wasn't interested. All of which is to say, these two escorts were fine. Still, that wasn't enough to make me want to see them or have sex with them again, or to make me go on living. Should I just die? The decision struck me as premature. Francois as a character attracts little, if any, sympathy. Even the relationship with his on-again, off-again girlfriend, Miriam, a woman who almost breaks the mold of Francois's various pathologies with her intimacy and her care, fails to move us. Francois cowardly sabotages his last chance with her, his last chance at authentic person-to-person love, and casually abandons her and her family in the middle of a real trial. Fittingly, she later dumps him via email. This is all rendered humorously by Houellebecq, of course, but the novel is, can be quite painful to read. As Helder McAlpin noted, if the insidious, passively accepted anti-Semitism and misogyny don't turn you off, Houellebecq's gratuitously graphic, loveless sex scenes will. Given the brokenness of Francois, it is no small coincidence that Submission has as its main subtext the work of Huysmans, whose pilgrim journey through aestheticism and decadence to an uneasy relationship with Catholicism in the late 19th century functions as a textual, cultural, and theological compass of Houellebecq's narrative, even if such a compass by novel's end is voluntarily and comically forfeited by its protagonist. Still, the place and power of beauty, of a meaningful and intelligible theological aesthetics, is one of the novel's primary achievements, even if too many critics view it as quiet subtext, as kind of like a dowager aunt in the back bedroom. Astute readers know better. Houellebecq manages to construct a narrative that blends both familiar strokes about dissipation and slow decline with, at first glance anyway, the possibility of redemption that usually attends in late modern novels where God-hauntedness is also a key protagonist. But God-hauntedness in Houellebecq's novel is a red herring, even if it is given to us as a keystone in the novel's epigraph, which is a text from Huysmans and his 1895 book, En Route. Here's a quote: "I am haunted by Catholicism, intoxicated by its atmosphere of incense and candle wax. I hover on its outskirts, moved to tears by its prayers, touched to the very marrow by its psalms and chants. I am revolted with my life. I am sick of myself, but so far from changing my ways. And yet, however troubled I am in these chapels, as soon as I leave them, I become unmoved and dry." However much Francois is intellectually moved by Huysmans and his character double, at least in En Route, Durtal, Francois is decidedly post-God. Even if, his back against the wall, he does attempt one last-ditch pseudo-pilgrimage to the shrine of the Black Madonna of Rocamadour to find out once and for all. But if there is a God in Submission, his name is self-preservation. And the grace he bestows are atomization, exhaustion, and finally, a cheap and pusillanimous spirit of accommodation. As Ellis Hansen notes, for Francois, by the novel's end, quote, "It is not only his intellectual life, but also his opportunity for a spiritual and emotional transfiguration that he abandons when he finally admits that his, quote, long, very long relationship with Joris Karl Huysmans is over." Of course, Houellebecq's sustained engagement with Huysmans in the novel draws us into a certain kind of territory. But it is also the encounter in the novel with prophetic figures from France's 20th century Catholic literary revival, Léon Blois and Charles Péguy, that sets us on a course to an expanded engagement with faith, culture, and the power of the word. Péguy is particularly important to the narrative, and Francois is clearly sympathetic to him, even if he misses what Péguy means to communicate and exalt at every turn. But the reader sees it if Francois does not. And Peggy's famous observation that, quote, "everything begins in mysticism and ends in politics," is the very spine of Houellebecq's novel, even if Houellebecq does not include the famous line in his text. While Peggy's project was to rejuvenate or instill a mystical freshness, to civic virtue in French life, Francois lacks both the interest and the capacity for such a higher calling. Francois is a tour de force burnout. Still, he tells the truth of things, even if it is informed by the incipient transactional sociopathy that forms his inner life. After all, as Francois muses, quote, "For the French, an intellectual didn't have to be responsible. That's not his job." And the reader can learn much from this 18-wheeler driving off a cliff in slow motion narrative of personal and collective exhaustion. French society and its political cultures are burned out. The rapacious and insatiable demands of global economic systems are exhausting the very people those systems are meant to serve. Religion and spirituality have been evacuated of their radiant objects by a weird kind of social fiat and are so left abandoned and dismembered, infantilized, impotent. People are world weary and fragile. The only thing missing in this mix is a global pandemic. In the novel, and closer to home for this audience, work in the academy also has lost its compass and appears more and more like a soulless game than it does a vocation. As Francois muses early in the narrative, quote, "The academic study of literature leads basically nowhere, as we all know, unless you happen to be an especially gifted student, in which case it prepares you for a career teaching the academic study of literature. It is, in other words, a rather farcical system that exists to replicate itself, and yet it manages to fail nearly 95% of the time." This decidedly is not the call of literature. And one thinks immediately of Walker Percy here, and that Houellebecq's novel makes the same point Percy does, albeit from a different literary universe. "You live in a deranged age," writes Percy in Lost in the Cosmos. "More deranged than usual because despite great scientific and technological advances, man has not the faintest idea of who he is or what he is doing." It is interesting to note another book that came on the scene in 2015, The Burnout Society by Korean-born German philosopher Byung-Chul Han. Han's brief study, his foray really, into exhaustion is to be commended as he broaches the malignant phenomenon from many angles. One that is of particular interest, especially for readers who are sensitive to the call of literature, is Han's treatment of Melville's Bartleby the Scrivener. And boy, I had some nice images of Bartleby, so let me go, dry my eyes. A sure precursor, Bartleby is a sure precursor to the age of exhaustion, if ever there was one. Following a reading developed by Deleuze, Han presents Bartleby as a prototype of late modern fatigue, a victim of the liturgies of early Fordist mechanization and the insatiable machinery of runaway capitalism. As Deleuze writes, quote, "Even in his catatonic or anorexic state, Bartleby is not the patient, but the doctor of sick America, the medicine man, the new Christ, or brother to us all." Francois, of course, is no Bartleby, but he certainly is a symptom of a neoliberal woundedness. In his case, it's a sustained moral and spiritual blindness, reinforced by the pressures of modern life, of commodification and atomization that slowly disconnect him from the people he loves and the things that once provided him with passion, purpose, and meaning. Neither Houellebecq nor Han, though, are moralists, right? But the links among moral injury, psychological turmoil, and spiritual aridity are under serious review in their work. Han's The Burnout Society indicts the toll that highly competitive achievement culture takes on us all. He then posits a kind of solution to this problem, one that this community will surely recognize. Quote, "We owe the cultural achievements of humanity, which include philosophy, to deep contemplative attention." An insight Joseph Pieper develops much more fully in his 1963 study, In Tune with the World, A Theory of Festivity, that's the book. And it's one central to a religious philosophy of ritual, festivity, and culture. Quote from Pieper, "The concept of festivity is inconceivable without an element of contemplation. And this contemplation performed in intentional liturgies explodes as an outward sign of acknowledgement, of right relationship, and of praise." Here's another quote. "This is as true today as it was 1,000 years ago," observes Pieper. It remains the form of the praise given in ritual worship, which is literally performed at every hour of the day. By its very nature, that praise is a public act, a festival celebrated before the face of creation. But as Ulbeck demonstrates, we are into new rituals here. Rituals of culture that replace or parody true festivity and therefore are bereft of authentic social and spiritual nourishment. It is interesting to note that Hahn's most recent book is called The Disappearance of Rituals, a Topology of the Present from 2020, where he notes that where there is no longer higher order, rituals disappear, and suggests incompletely, for Hahn has yet to make a sustained theological turn, but he suggests perceptively how rituals mitigate against exhaustion, a point not lost on Melville or Pieper. The subtitle of Melville's 1853 story is A Story of Wall Street, and it appears to the reader, with all of its transsignified elements of Christianity reordered to a commercial trajectory, as a lifeless pseudo-liturgy of our own making. Bartleby's Stations of the Cross Odyssey on his way to the dead letter office, and finally to imprisonment and death in the tombs of lower Manhattan, presents as a kind of capitalist Via Dolorosa. In Submission, the pilgrimage trope is also in play, but it is altogether of a different quality. Francois retreats from ugly Parisian Republican rallies to Rocamadour, where Huysmans and the pious French kings had also made pilgrimages to the Black Madonna. He sits before the Virgin in the chapel and listens to young Catholics dressed in polo shirts artfully recite a subset of Peggy's 4,000 Alexandrians, just a small subset, that make up his 1913 poem, Eve. Francois's cynicism is softened by the sacred as he arrives at the critical, and I say the spiritual turning point of the novel. And so let us look at, I'll quote Willbeck a little longer here, more in full, so we can properly inhabit the space. So, as for these young Catholics, did they love their homeland? Were they ready to give up everything for their country? I felt ready to give up everything, not really for my country, but in general. I was in a strange state. It seemed as if the Virgin was rising from her pedestal and growing in the air. The baby Jesus seemed ready to detach himself from her. And it seemed to me that all he had to do was raise his right hand and the pagans and the idolaters would be destroyed. And the keys to the world restored to him as its, quote, Lord, its possessor, its master. And then these Peggy lines come in on top of some music. Mother, behold, our sons so lost to themselves. Judge them not on base intrigue, but welcome them back like the prodigal son. Let them return to outstretched arms. And then Francois says this, or maybe I was just hungry. I'd forgotten to eat the day before, and possibly what I should do is go back to my hotel, my hotel, and sit down to a few duck's legs instead of falling down in the pews in an attack of mystical hypoglycemia. I can't help but think of Dickens and A Christmas Carol here when Scrooge, awakened by Marley and read the riot act by Marley, decides that Marley is a biophantom, quote, an undigested bit of beef, a mystical hypoglycemia. But he's mistaken. So, as I conclude, there is a theology here, of course, and it's one offered by Henri de Lubac, and one that provides an anchor, thinking as we do about the Francois of the world, or our own inner Francois. If God had willed to save us without our own cooperation, Christ's sacrifice by itself would have sufficed. But does not the very existence of our Savior presuppose a lengthy period of collaboration on man's part? Now, at first glance, this sounds so Pelagian, right? So kind of DIY, salvation. But I don't think it is. In its heart, it amplifies the call to relationship, the call of the living word. But in a world where happiness and wonder are increasingly manipulated by the scripts of plastic desire and the raw power of markets, by the liturgy of bread and circuses, It is difficult to discern the call or to hear the voice. It becomes easier and easier in our context, so screen saturated and more, to lawyer oneself out of engaging with the religious dimension. It's easier to lose contact with the life-giving liturgy of bread and wine. Ulbeck's satire helps us to think about these things and to contemplate, again, the proposition by St. John Chrysostom, illuminated by Pieper in his text. Ubi caritas gaudet, ibi es festivitas. Where love rejoices, there is festivity. Thank you.
Thank you. That's brilliant, Michael. Thank you very much indeed. And sorry we didn't have the accompanying slides, but
No problem. Yeah.
Fascinating presentation. And I can see lots of areas of interaction. We may have a couple of minutes for questions. I don't know if anyone wants to kind of follow any of that up.
Yeah, I would welcome them as well. Any pushback?
Got a raised hand, but
Nicholas?
yeah. Although I'm literally a stone's throw away from the Trevi fountain, which Michael Kirwan talked about. But, there's a point in Welbeck's Soumission that I wanted to go back to it, which I don't think Michael Murphy addressed, which I thought was the most terrifying, apart from the banality of the life and the sheer boredom. It's when the Islamic Party wins the election. And then there's these snippets of news that, I mean, they've taken over the media, and there's this kind of silence that falls, and it's moved into like a post-truth world where, I don't know, I find there was like a silence that screams. I mean, it was I found that almost the most shocking part is that all of it was just fabricated and mendacious. So I don't know if theologically there's something behind that, but
I would thanks Father Steves. You know, I've been thinking a lot about I mentioned something about this kind of eclipse, or this kind of not suppression, but this amnesia about religion, or this failure to engage as a social fiat, how things just kind of happen right before your eyes. And I think people my parents' age may have been through this in some ways as they grew up in the last part of World War II or something like that. But what I mean to say is that I'm just struck by Elizabeth Newman's proposition of a silent spiral where nobody says anything in the face of all these lies, and then it's just really compounded by the saturation of digital media and the manipulation. So I think Ulbeck is really painting a world. It's not a pretty one, but it's the world in which we dwell. And I mean, we're living in it now. So that's my reply.
Anybody else? We have a couple of minutes still. Mike, I was very struck by the comments on liturgy and ritual, and clearly that's part. There's a little bit of that in the Goethe text as well, when he goes to the liturgy and, oh, this is going to be good, and then he's disappointed by it. But I'm just linking that with the point about mysticism ending up in politics, and the kind of political implications, or the theological political implications. I'm just thinking of the work of someone like Agamben, who's taking up the theme of the Sabbath, and at the heart of politics is the inoperativity of us praising. He's picking up the end of the Confessions, where the Sabbath is we're going to be praising. That's what we'll be doing. So we'll be free of that frenetic activity and the burnout and all the rest of it. It seems to be an interesting theme to explore there, that if we can get away from a sense of politics of doing things, but actually get back to the inoperativity that should be at the heart of life and politics. And ritual, of course, gives expression to that. I wonder if there's a connection to be made there.
I would love to hear from one of our other fellows, or our colleagues on that. I think that's a beautifully put. I couldn't agree more. That the idea of inoperativity is really quite something. I mean, is it the same as leisure?
Well, it seems to be a number of things. That it's the fact that the Sabbath rest. It's his rendition of the biblical term, the Sabbath rest. And what we're going to be doing, we're going to be praising. So the notion of glory, and of course, politics has a hint of that, because we have these rituals and pomp and ceremony attached to even secular politics, which looks absurd. But it's an intuition that somehow glorification is tied in with the acknowledgement of the political order.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. And I think, if you add the kind of crass consumerism below the politics, or which is almost like is interchangeable or taken over from the politics. We know that we do, the political is far more corporate these days. We are just given all these red herrings, and these are liturgies that never satisfy. But they use the same machinery, to borrow from Agamben, of theology. So I think what Agamben is doing is really interesting. But I think also, and I haven't read him in a little while, but although I'm looking at Homo Sac here right now on my shelf, but and it's taunting me. But it seems like he, in his Agamben's using all the structures of theology. I don't think he pays theology back properly somehow.
That's what
yeah.
Raiding the storehouses, so to speak. Yeah, David.
David Jasper. Yeah.
Well, I'm just, to either of you really, would be interested to know, would it have made a difference if this session had happened at the beginning of last year, before we had all started living virtual lives? It's wonderful to hear of Goethe's journey to Italy and so on. And I mean, very few of us have actually been anywhere outside, almost the walls of our own houses for the last 18 months. And also liturgically, we talk about the liturgy, but actually what the consequences are going to be of actually being, this forum is hardly a context for a liturgical event. I've been sitting in my desk as we all have, in my study for the last 2 days. I've barely moved, and I just really wonder whether, actually that's something that really this is a brand new phenomenon that we've just suddenly had inflicted upon us.
We have 20 seconds to respond. but yeah, I do think that notion of the travel journey and describing the travel, ultimately, you can read all the guidebooks and they will help you. And there's a kind of